We just learned how to navigate throughout our application using the link component and the history property that we get from React Router DOM. Now, how would we actually go about setting up our menu item so that it allows us to navigate to different pages? More specifically, we want to use our hats menu item to navigate to our new hats page. Well, one of the caveats of using those properties that we get from route, which is the match, the history, and the location property, is that we actually only get access to them from the first component that gets passed into our route. So even though directory and menu item are children of our homepage component, only our homepage component gets access to the history prop that we need, because it's the homepage component that we're passing into route. So route only passes it one child in, which is its child, so our homepage. One solution we could do is we could pass these props down into our directory. We could pass the history into our directory, and then we can pass that history from our directory down into our menu item. This.props.history. And by doing so, our menu item now has access to the history in its props. The problem with doing it this way is that this is actually a bad pattern called prop tunneling, because we're tunneling these props multiple children deep in order to get them to the component that needs them. But the children in between don't actually need the history property for any reason other than to pass it to their children. Now, luckily, there's a solution that React Router DOM provides us that allows us to not have to do this. So let's take a look. So first, let's undo that prop tunneling code that we just wrote. We don't need that either. And what we're going to use is actually another component from React Router DOM. And this component is called withRouter. Now, what withRouter is it's a higher order component. And a higher order component is essentially a function that takes a component as an argument and returns you a modified component. So just like how our menu item is a function that takes props and renders out a component, a higher order component is a function that takes any component and modifies it in some way and then returns you that new modified component. So it's kind of like a function that gives you back a powered up component. In this case, we're powering up our menu item component to have access to those things related to our router. So what we would do is we just pass our, not history. We just pass our menu item component into this withRouter. And withRouter will then return us back with the same name of this menu item, right? Whatever it is that we're exporting by default, it will return us back a super powered menu item component with access now to those location, match, and history props that we need access to. So by wrapping now, we now have access to history. And what we want to do with history is we want to wrap our whole div item so that on click, we're going to push history.push to some URL. Now, how do we do this? Well, what we want to be able to do is have these URL IDs almost be dynamically generated as well. Because we know that where we're going is going to be the hats page. So we know that our route needs a hats route, right? So what we can do for now, just to hard code it, is we can go into our directory component and add a URL parameter here, like a link of sorts, right? Link URL. And we're just going to set this to hats. So after this, we want to add the same value, but to every other section. But for now, we'll just keep it as an empty string because we don't actually have those other routes set up yet. Now we're going to pass this link URL into our menu item. And it is on our section, right, that we're mapping through. But because we're getting more and more verbose, it's very easy for us to just do this again, link URL. And then to pass it in as link URL. But you'll notice that these keys that we're destructuring off are essentially equivalent to the exact same property name that we're also passing in to our menu item. So there's actually a little ES6 trick we can do by spreading the rest of these values together that we don't need for key, because ID, we're not actually passing in as ID. We can remove that and then set the rest of them as section props or other section props. And now we can spread those values in like this. And this is equivalent to us writing out what we did before. By spreading these values through, we're saying that every other key value pair we want to pass in where the key of title goes to the value of men's. So this is equivalent to us having done that. And now in our menu item, we will have access to the link URL, which we now want to push. However, we also don't know in our menu item where in our directory we will be. So what we can do is we can take the match as well. And just like in our demonstration earlier, we can do match.url into link URL. And now if we save this, we should see if we click our hats page, it navigates us to our hats page. And if we were to change our URL at any point, our component is still fully aware and functional because it knows that it's just going to base where it's been matched up to and then append the URL. And with that, we have some basic navigation setup inside of our menu item component. So now, with this in mind, let's commit our code. So let's see what we have to commit. So we have to now update our menu items to navigate with router HOC. Now we're going to explore this concept of higher order component further a little later when we write our own. But for now, just remember, our higher order component is just a function that takes another component as an argument, transforms it into another component, and returns that transformed component out of itself. So we'll definitely explore that further. But for now, just think about it simply like that. So let's git push origin master our code, and let's move on to the next lesson.